All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but to provide a platform to share their voice and ideas to a more accessible world. Today, I'm joined by Edward Heath, the former Marine, strength and conditioning coach, CrossFit athlete, and Paralympic athlete as well, an advocate for amputees in his home state of Maryland. John, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me, brother. I'm excited.
All right, so maybe let's go back to your childhood and your first introduction to sports. Growing up, what were you passionate about?
So I played a lot of basketball. I obviously grew up in a situation of foster kids, so I think our escape was going to the local basketball court. Football was never my thing as a child. That developed further on in the years. But I think, honestly, what really got me was once I decided to get out of my current situation and I knew that I had to join the military to do so. It's where my passion for weightlifting started. So what created this idea was I realized real quick that I was actually pretty strong and I started gaining muscle pretty quick. And that's kind of what, the trajectory to my athletic career.
So you served 10 years in the Marines,
I did, yes.
and that was 5 years ago when you were?
Yeah, I got out in 2019.
And during that time you were injured. We won't cover it in its entirety, but led to an amputation. So for those who aren't familiar with your story, above knee, below knee.
Yeah, so I'm a below the knee amputee. I got injured in 2016. It's very, very political in how it happened. But what I will tell you is my injury was not what caused the amputation. It was trying to salvage my limb that caused the amputation. So by the time we realized it, I had 2 or 3 initial surgeries when I got injured. And then by the time you looked back, we were sitting at 10. I got separated from the military. And then 2019, I underwent my 11th surgery. And that was probably the worst one because I caught a bone and tissue staph infection and then had surgery number 12. COVID happened. So here I am limping around and trying to figure out. But I competed in Olympic weightlifting in the military. So I was still competing with a bum leg and I was still performing military standards with a bum leg. I guess it was just the toxic mentality of, go hard and doesn't matter if this is hurting. So I kind of thought that was my new normalcy. And then in 2019, Kenny Mayne, he's an ESPN reporter where he was, but he paid for a specific prosthetic that I wore and it was called the IDEO Exosim. And this prosthetic was called the Super Brace, was created to bring service members back into service with salvaged limbs. And I didn't know this. This was created in 2009. I didn't know about it until 2019. So with the IDEO Exosim, I still competed and whatnot, but I was still having a lot of pain from the neurological and just the damage. So to give you an idea, my leg was the size of my forearm. So it was dead. I was getting bone marrow transfusions. I had 2 Achilles replacements. I had an ankle replacement. I had, it was a lot of work that they were trying to do that by the end of the 12th surgery, I was done and I had to advocate for an amputation.
Yeah, so it was an elective amputation.
Oh, yeah. But it was an elective that I had to pretty much beg for because when I first brought it up to them, they was like, we're not amputating. We know this other doctor and this other doctor that can fix you. And it was a very stressful process because my biggest fear was to leave service with a bum leg. I had heard so much negative connotations on, medical care for veterans that I didn't want to come to the civilian world with this issue. And that's exactly what happened. And I called it too in 2018 when they were like, we're not amputating you. I was like, you guys are going to wait till I'm 30 years old.
That's what happened. What's the reluctancy?
I guess, so now that I'm older and I have a lot of relationships with a lot of doctors because I've seen the best of the best. I'm going to be honest with you. think of it as a coach, right? Like if somebody tells you hey, I'm trying to be a sprinter and they're coming to you and you're like, hey, my specialty is football, right? You're going to send them to another coach. That's kind of what it was in the medical field where it was like, all right, we might not be able to fix it. This person might be able to fix it. And it was kind of at the time I was very pissed because it was like, you guys are treating me like a guinea pig. now that I'm older, I kind of feel like, all right, they were really trying to save my leg. But at some point,
Yeah.
at what point do we call it
Right.
quits, right? Because I kind of feel like 13 is a little too much.
Yeah. So you had to advocate for it. And now is the bill that you're working on in Maryland related to that whole process?
It is not. So what you need to know is that every state is different, but every state is kind of the same in this aspect. So if you were to become an amputee right now, or insurance companies are only required to provide you one prosthetic for movement. And what
Right.
people don't understand is, think of shoes. You wear running shoes, you wear Metcons for CrossFit, you wear cleats for soccer. It's the same concept for prosthetics. You cannot run in a walking leg. You cannot surf on a walking leg. You cannot run on a weightlifting leg. You cannot, hike on a CrossFit leg. So each specific prosthetic is meant for a special need. And in order for amputees to be actively fit, or even just, active for health and wellness, they need a secondary prosthetic. Insurance companies have been deeming them not medically necessary. But as of January 1st, 2025, Maryland will require insurance companies to provide a secondary prosthetic for movement.
Okay. So, and then what categorizes that? Can it be a sprinting limb?
Mate, any movement
Any?
is movement. So,
Okay.
like, if you are a rock climber and you're requesting a rock climbing leg, that's a secondary prosthetic for movement. So
Okay.
it's not really, because the codes are the same, and that's kind of how there was opposition when we were fighting for this bill, and that's kind of how the opposition was trying to get us, was like, oh, this costs more money than not. Come to find out, both codes are the same. So insurance
Okay.
companies are being billed. If you're trying to get, now granted, it gets more technical, right? Like, you wouldn't give the average amputee a prosthetic sprinting blade, right? But you would give them a category 3 or 4 in a running blade, which are two different prosthetics. The running blade and the walking blade are the same codes. It's the same amount of money that they're spending.
Okay. So January 1st, 2025, is that exclusive? You said in Maryland. Are there other states? Are there other states that have that?
Yeah, so we're the 6th state. There's 5 other states that have done it: New Mexico, Colorado, Arkansas. I forgot the other 2, but I've got all the information. And we've got, I want to say, 20 states working on this legislation. I'm kind of working with someone in Michigan right now to kind of attack this federally, because the idea is, so the founder of this, like, the idea of this is Nicole. She was the one who pretty much created the So Everybody Can Move movement. But her idea is to do 28 states by 2028 Olympics, which I think is awesome. But I feel like we could do 50 states by then, right? So I'm trying to use my network and connections to kind of speed up the process, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. What was that process like over the last couple of years?
So for Maryland, it's 90 days, mate. You've got 90 days to change a law, which is not a lot of time. So there was a lot of groundwork. Luckily, I have a great team, man. Cheryl Sachs, she is a clinician for orthotics and prosthetics, and the passion she had to change this for her patients, that's honestly what drove this entire initiative. Like, she was losing sleep, man, trying to create, the amendments for the bills, and anytime there was something wrong on my end, like, luckily for me, I had the power of the media, right? So I was punching out on social media, I was being interviewed on TV, so I'm spreading awareness. You were educating the senators, the delegates, and everybody, because here's the thing, it's not that people don't care. I think it's people don't know. So if you're not an amputee, or if you don't have a disabled person in your family, how truly educated are you on these movements and on these initiatives, right? So, but we got a lot of support, man. And what we were told is, like, the last time a prosthetic law was changed in Maryland was in 1990. And then it's very rare for a bill to be introduced first time and be voted. So it was voted unanimously in the Senate. In the House of Delegates, there was one nay. I don't know if he did it by mistake, but it was funny because when everybody saw the nay, they kind of like Googled his name and like screenshot it, and they're like, go find him and put a prosthetic on his desk.
That's tough. That's tough. What was the value proposition that you had to kind of communicate to the legislators and stuff to make that decision?
So I will tell you, so I won the Senate vote. I think the Senate vote, listened to my case was I don't need this law to change. As a former, like as a veteran, your taxpaying dollars will pay for my prosthetics for the rest of my life, right? So I was very naive in that aspect because I thought the accessibility to prosthetics and movement was common for everybody. So here I am showing up to these competitions and I'm like, why aren't you lifting with a VersaFoot 2, from BioAdapt? And why are you running on your, I was so naive into it that that is what motivated me to help the average citizen in our country, right? Because I was like, okay, so if this is very exclusive to veterans, what is the demographics for the average disabled person? Brendan, I've met amputees that have not ran in like 15 years because they've been denied a running prosthetic, and let alone it's expensive to be disabled, right? So that's another topic. So like that's just the prosthetic itself. What about the sleeve that goes on it, the liner that goes on your limb? A sleeve costs $300. Mate, I'm ripping sleeves every like other day. Why would somebody want to be physically active if you're telling me that I have to pay $300 out of pocket for a sleeve? You
Yeah.
cannot
Yeah.
argue, that logic with individuals. So for the Senate, I was able to prove that, and then in the House of Delegates, man, my guy Nate, he's a adolescent. He plays baseball. He's an amputee, and he sold it, man. He had the House of Delegates vote. They all were very inspired by what he had to say. And then just the biggest perspective that I gave people, you got to understand disability doesn't choose you. So you can get on your car and think everything's going to be fine if you get in that car accident, and now you're an amputee. You just voted on something against something that could have helped your situation, right? So it was putting it into perspective.
Let me grab one thing real quick. I'll be back in 20
Yep.
seconds.
Yep.
I had like a buzzing in my headphones, so I just wanted to plug them in. Yeah, so the cost of adaptive equipment is definitely one of the biggest barriers, it feels like, for most adaptive sports, whether it's like push room wheelchair racing or even sport chairs for wheelchair athletics. So is there a way to get the cost of prosthetics down? Like, what do you think is the path forward to having those sleeves be less expensive? And
Unfortunately, it's insurance, right? I think medical devices. People are making a living out of medical devices, and that's kind of so. Like, I'm gonna give you an example. My family was just here from Iceland, and my cousin has type 2 diabetes, and he's always wanted to live in the United States, and it's a 5 hour flight from here to Reykjavik, right? So I asked him, I was like, why don't you do it? Like, I'll help you. I've got a spare bedroom. Like, we can figure out what's next. And his biggest concern is insulin, right? So it's like you have somebody foreign in Europe that is getting insulin through their medical care system, but we're in the United States where it's like it's not part of it, right? Like it's not. I have another friend who was trying to get a visa from Brazil to Australia. They denied his visa because they said he was gonna cost them more money because he's an amputee, right? So it's kind of like I don't really know that answer on how to make it cheaper because you're also paying for the work that a clinician, OMP is doing. But if you really look at it, my prosthetist loses money with helping me as a professional athlete. And why do I say that? Because I break things a lot. They just upfronted 2 sleeves that they overnighted because the VA system takes forever to get new sleeves in. And I had a competition, I had nationals last week, right? So, like, I'm not running 100 meters and probably one of the most important races of the season with a ripped sleeve, right? So, there's a lot of factors that they didn't charge me that came out of pocket. They shipped it out. And when I was training in Florida, and I was breaking stuff, I was walking in without appointments, without prescriptions. So at the end of the day, OMP that cares for an amputee is actually losing money. So I don't really have the answer for that.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone really does,
Yeah.
but hopefully hopefully the legislation, like the stuff that you're working on, will move it along in some regards, or at least get it covered to make it more
Right.
accessible for people. So, for people who aren't familiar with the Paralympic classification, can you maybe give us a little bit of an idea of maybe both how it worked in the snowboarding world and then now how it works in the sprinting world?
Yeah, so what it is T is for track, F is for field, right? So I'm a T64, and what 64 means is that I am a below the knee amputee. Every number has their own entities. If you're an above the knee, it's a 63, which is what is the turmoil. The Paralympic classification is what the turmoil is in adaptive CrossFit, because adaptive CrossFit is classifying individuals that may have residual limb problems, right? So like I compete against the guy who still has a leg. I don't really know his issues, and and I understand, listen, to a certain extent, like HIPAA, and you can't really give this person's disability, but I kind of feel like if you're in the athletic space, you kind of have to, I feel like you kind of give that up, right? Because as an amputee, nobody's questioning what my disability is, right? They're like, he's a lower extremity, adaptive CrossFit athlete. Oh, he's missing a leg, right? So when your justification as somebody who competed with a salvaged limb and is now an amputee, if I'm telling you that it is two different standards, I could still do a lot of things with a salvaged limb. There are a lot of things that I cannot do as an amputee, and I just don't think we're at that level yet in every other sport but the Paralympics, right? And I understand Paralympics has more money, but I've never competed against a non-amputee in the Paralympics, whether it's snowboarding, whether it's track and field. I'm competing solely against other amputees. And I kind of want to figure out how to fix that in CrossFit, because there is a disadvantage to amputees when it comes to the classification process, because you have a lot, you've got a lot of like salvaged limbs that are in 1 point, which is like equivalent to an AK. But you cannot convince me that a fusion is the same as missing a knee. I can't, as somebody who's in the space as a coach, and it just doesn't sit well with me.
Do you think it's not large enough of a field size? Like there's not enough people in each classification to the point where you're only competing against a couple people, so they're trying to lump them together, so it's kind of bigger field sizes?
No, I don't think that applies to amputees. So what you need to know is the amputee division, no matter what sport it is, will always be the most competitive. Whether it's triathlon, whether it's sprinting, whether it's CrossFit, there's a lot of amputees. And that's what's been the hardest thing about adaptive CrossFit, is because like you have individuals who do have like two people in a division, and then they'll go compete and they consider themselves elite athletes, but they're not really competing for their spot. And then you have someone like us where it's like, we've got 10 amputees that you're each, coming for each other's throats for that podium spot. So I don't think that's doable. I just don't think that the people classifying are truly comprehending. Yes, they may have an equivalent to above the knee issues, but having a limb versus not having a limb is two different anatomies of the body. And I just don't think that they're understanding that, because I did it. I competed with a salvaged limb. I had a fused ankle. I wore an IDEO exosim. I can't move the way that I used to move with a salvaged limb.
Yeah. It seems like it would be easy enough to solve. Just allowing people like yourself to kind of guide the process.
Right.
Is there a panel of adaptive athletes who are helping them make these decisions? Are you aware?
I don't think there's a panel. I think it's just the people running the divisions. And the thing about it is they're very knowledgeable. I just think that they need more. Like I would never, as a coach, I would never question a seated athlete. Like if you're telling me this is what I can do, and I'll test that a little bit to make sure you're not trying to give me I've never done this before, but I will never sit here and say like seated 2 and 3, like this is your standard. I'm not a seated athlete. I'm not in a wheelchair. I can't give you that. I can vouch for an AK. I can vouch for a BK. I can vouch for a minor lower. I will never vouch for somebody who's missing an upper or is blind. Like I can't give you that. I'm not the subject matter expert in that. So I
Yeah,
think
that
there needs to be a panel.
yeah, that theme of like people with disabilities are often neglected in the process of deciding things for people with disabilities
Right.
seems to be an unfortunate theme
Right.
across both athletics and business and all sorts of domains. So, yeah, I think that they say like nothing about us without us. So hopefully organizations like CrossFit will start to leverage athletes like yourself who have a better understanding of the demands of the sport based on their disability. And was the I don't follow the space too closely, but is the transition to wheel wad taking over some of the adaptive CrossFit space positive?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Um, there's a huge divide. I don't think CrossFit is backing Wheelwad as much as they should. I understand that there's a lot of growing pains. I'm happy they're giving people a space. It just doesn't sit well with me that you're spending all of this money and your prize purse is $2,000 as a first place winner. That doesn't sit well with me. I've heard the podcasts from other elite adaptive CrossFit athletes. A lot of people don't understand, like, majority of them have full-time jobs. I used to coach Division 1 football. Like, I have the credentials to go coach at a high level. I gave that all up for Paralympics and adaptive sports. So when you're sitting here and telling me like you need to suck it up and I've sucked it up for 3 years and I'm not watching progression. So they have full-time jobs. Of course you can say that. This is my life. You're messing with my livelihood at this point. So with the amount of money that I spend in traveling, like to give you an idea, 2023 season for me cost me $120,000. That is coaches, rehab. That is a performance coach. So track coach, performance coach, chiropractor, physio, massage therapist. That is traveling with your team. That is flights. That's hotels. That's food. That's competitions internationally. Minimum $10,000. So it just doesn't sit. And how do we fix that? I don't know, but I understand that able-bodied adaptive CrossFit athletes generate more money and more viewership, but to look at a paycheck divide like that, they're in the $300,000. And you mean to tell me that as an elite adaptive CrossFit athlete, I'm getting paid $2,000? If you get second place, you're getting $500, or third place, you're getting $500. It just doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah, hopefully the more prevalent Paralympic coverage this summer, as well as just like some of the new sponsors that are moving into the adaptive sports space, will allow athletes like yourself to kind of elicit the sponsorships in the same way that for I guess lack of a better term, able-bodied athletes have access to. Where are you kind of directing your competitive efforts predominantly now?
So I had some problems with CrossFit this season. It is what it is. I'm still going out there to support them. I'm actually sponsoring a couple athletes through my nonprofit. But I'm going to be honest with you. I think I'm going to stick to the Paralympics,
Yeah.
unfortunately. It's just, I've put a lot of time and effort to CrossFit for 3 years, and you kind of keep beating your head on the wall, and I got to do what's best for me at this point, unfortunately. But I think it's going to be track and field for me. And, my coach, Keith Gable, dude's got like 61 medals in snowboarding. He supports my decision. And I mean, the idea is to get on that team for snowboarding for 2026 and then make the team for 2028 for LA Olympics, right? Like I missed it this year. I'm not upset about it because what everybody needs to understand is I spent a lot of my time with this bill change. I spent a lot of my time with this nonprofit. Most of my time isn't deviated to me. It's to helping the disabled community. If you saw my DMs and my text messages and the calls that I'm in, and just trying to leverage and help individuals, whether it's with resources, qualifications, standards. Like I just had a couple guys from Australia contact me because we're having a competition, the Down Under Challenge through Adapted RX. And it was like, hey, I need help with these standards, right? I don't work for these people, but at the end of the day, like if I don't give them the answers or at least guide them in the right direction, then I'm not really helping the community.
So snowboarding for 2026 and then sprinting for 2028?
Correct.
Yeah. We are grateful for the support of our first show sponsor. Resolution Fitness offers leading brand health club equipment and accessories for residential and commercial use. In addition to traditional exercise equipment, they specialize in adaptive fitness products and wheelchair accessible machines. If you're interested in outfitting your fitness facility or home gym to be more accessible, visit www.resolutionfitness.ca or the link in the show notes below. So what is the qualification process, I guess, like for a Paralympic season?
So you would start training. So last year I was in the most elite track and field team. We started in October, which I've never done before. I also don't think that it was meant for me, which is why I'm no longer on the team. It's not about not having the knowledge. I think there has to be a communication between the athlete and the coach as a disabled person, right? So if I'm telling you that this is way too much volume, yes, as a coach, you need to like question me whether I'm, trying to get out of a rep or whether it's truly affecting my anatomy as an amputee. And I developed a severe sciatic nerve problem last season. And it was because I was being ran through the dirt, right? It's the same with CrossFit. Like I joined Mayhem. Mayhem was way too much. It was tiring me out by Tuesday. I still had 5 days to train. It was just way too much volume. So training would start in October. You would off-season train, and then you would get your first meet. And what sucks for us as Paralympic athletes, our season is actually shorter. So our trials for Worlds would be like April, and then Worlds would be like May, right? And then my teammates would run from like their first meet in like February until like June, and then Worlds would be like in July, right? So they have a little bit more time to compete. And the other thing is there's not a lot of Paralympic track meets. So luckily my coach was well established and he got me in a lot of big name track meets at universities, but that doesn't help me running against somebody with two legs,
Yeah. Was there trials like there was for Olympic trials?
So Paralympic trials happens today, actually. So it starts today and it ends on Saturday. I think shock put starts today, and then the 200's tomorrow, and then the 100 is on Saturday. So it'll be on Peacock if you want to watch.
Yeah,
No free shout outs. I don't work for Peacock.
And then so next year will be more dedicated to snowboarding then
Well, I'll still be in track. So what my idea is to do off-season training for track and then do track for snowboarding, right? So like there is a lot of weights and conditioning for snowboarding, but it's not as intense as it needs to be for track and field. So my idea is using the track. So what I did this year, and people don't know, is like my track training was CrossFit. So to have like won my meets and like still be, contending against people, it was kind of funny because I didn't have a coach this year.
Yeah.
So I was just working with the bare minimum, and my conditioning and strength training was CrossFit.
Yeah, hopefully with some
cool.
Maybe with some more specific like technical coaching and like more specific workouts for the 100 and the 200 we'll get you over the hump there. For people who maybe, you mentioned that as an amputee, you might not be able to handle as much volume as some of your other teammates, etc. Since our audience is predominantly in the fitness space, are there any like blanket or generalizations that you can make for a coach who might be working with an amputee, like what you would want them to understand about training one?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, and that's a great question, because I think at the beginning, we all need to understand. So I'm part of a lot of amputee groups, and there's a lot of like, oh, this hurts, I can't walk, right? And the best advice I got from amputees when I first got amputated was like, don't ever take your prosthetic off until you go to bed. And what that does is that calluses your limb. And unfortunately, carbon fiber is not part of the human body. So carbon fiber in a residual limb, of course, it's going to hurt. Once you're over that hump, You don't ever really go through that pain unless you need a new socket, right? So I would say, as a coach, you really, really have to flirt with that line of excessive and also like, let's push it a little bit more, right? That's where the communication comes in, because there will be times where it's like, hey, I can't do this. Um,
Lost you there for a second.
yeah, are you back?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You said that, yep. You said that's where the communication comes in with the coach.
That's where the communication comes in, because at certain times, like, you're going to try, you're going to be like, oh, my leg hurts. Does your leg really hurt? You just don't want to do this rep. So I would say that's the first phase. The second phase, what I've learned, I'm a very short BK. So I had an amputation. 6 months later, I went back into surgery for an emergency surgery, and they took more of my leg. I'm a very short BK. There are certain things that I cannot physically do that I don't think people take into consideration, because they'll look at like a teammate and they're like, but he can do that. And I'm like, I understand that, but look at his residual limb. It's like almost down to his shin. I have an inch below my knee. There's not a lot of give back from my residual limb as far as like coming up from a lunge or jumping on a 24-inch box. Like, they had 30-inch boxes for the CrossFit semifinals. And I'm like, there's no way I can jump that. It's not about like me not trying to make the standard. I cannot physically do that. So I would think, honestly, like, the evaluation plays a major role between an athlete and a coach on what you can and can't do. And again, flirting with that line, because there's a lot of disabled people that were told you cannot do this and they never tried it. There's a difference between trying it and getting proficient at it. And then there's a difference between saying like, I can't do it and not giving it a try at all.
What are some safety considerations that you think trainers should be aware of, just in terms of an amputee within the scope of a workout?
The heat plays a major role into the prosthetic. So if you're super sweaty, that prosthetic's going to slip around in the sweat and it's going to cause cuts and blisters. I would say the cold plays a factor as well. A lot of people don't understand that the weather plays a role, because in the heat, we swell up, meaning that we need extra socks because our limb is shrinking, right? And then vice versa, you get swollen. So I would say heat plays a major role. Sweat plays a major role. Phantom pain. If your amputee has phantom pain, they're not going to get through a workout with phantom pain. And then I would have to say, truly, the cuts from the prosthetic. Man, I have a very good squat. If you've ever seen any videos of me on Instagram, I've got a very, very, very good squat as an amputee. But I cut the back of my leg with the carbon fiber, and there's a certain tolerance of cutting that I can do, and then there's a certain like level where I'm like, hey, I'm not going to try that, because like that's going to either get infected or it's just going to make it worse, So
you wouldn't necessarily say there are any like specific exercises that are off limits. It's more so in terms of the physiological response within the residual limb and within the prosthetic.
100%. And I would honestly throw what in there is like the biggest key factor of a brand new amputee is strengthening their amputee side. So the glute, hamstrings, all of that is not activated anymore. You need to have extra emphasis on that. But I don't think there's a specific workout or movement that an amputee can't do.
Yeah. Gait seems to be highly individualized for every amputee to a degree. Like, do you think I guess that makes it hard to coach to a degree, because there's no like textbook standard of what it should look like. Are there specific like qualities that you'd be looking for in assessing gait, or things that you're working on as a sprinter?
Yes. So I will tell you, so I'm sponsored by Rehab to Perform. And Rehab to Perform, if it wasn't for them, I would not have what you call a normal gait. And I hate calling it normal, but what Dr. Funk and Dr. Drew did is we solely focused on like 12 weeks of walking. Like, it was very, very minimal at the beginning, like lifting weights. It was all, how do we teach you how to walk again? And how do we strengthen your hip flexors? And how do we create a rhythm for you to walk, right? And that was probably the most successful thing that a PT and a coach could have ever done for my career, but also for like the longevity of my life as a disabled person. So I would say truly like trying to make that walk as normal as possible with a prosthetic. And then the second thing would be like, you got to get used to that blade, man. So if you're running as a sprinter, the prosthetic is mounted on a posterior mount. It's not straight off the bottom. So what you feel essentially is like you're floating because the carbon fiber is on the back and the socket sits right here. So you're essentially floating. So when you first start running, you're firing up muscle groups that you've never fired up previously with your actual limb, right? So it's getting used to that and just really strengthening those. Like now I don't have those problems. Like I remember the first 6 months of training on the track, like I would have to stop because it was like I was feeling these muscles activate that I had never really used for running before. So just the anatomy of running is completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize that you were working with Josh and the R2P team. They've always put out they've always put out awesome resources. Highly recommend people to follow 100%.
them. Free shout out for them.
Yeah, I know. You're shouting everybody out. So I guess shifting gears slightly, what were your like initial, I guess, emotional reactions to becoming an amputee? And like, did you immediately go to, I'm still going to be a competitive athlete, it's just going to look slightly different?
Good question. So my significant other committed suicide at the same time that I lost my leg. So I was undergoing that. And then I thought I was coming back to Olympic weightlifting. So when I made the decision, I called my pastor, I called my foster parents, I called Alex Smith. He was a quarterback for the Redskins. He was a mentor of mine at that time frame. And everybody was like, this is what's holding you back, right? So when I made the decision to get amputated, I was like, let's get amputated. Let's learn how to do all this, and then we'll be back on a platform for Olympic weightlifting. Come to find out, Olympic weightlifting is not in the Paralympics. It's only powerlifting. And in powerlifting, it's only the bench event. I am not a bencher, okay? I'm an Olympic weightlifter. I want the barbell over my head. I don't want it in front of my chest. So, backtracking, two-time Olympian and wide receiver for the Eagles, Devin Allen, was the one who took me to the hospital when I got amputated, okay? So what I need to emphasize to people is that my surrounding was what created this skyrocket of a career post-amputation, because I'm watching Devin Allen, Joe Delgado, Morgan Mitchell train for Tokyo. I'm surrounded around guys like Sonny Webster, he's an Olympic weightlifter, Alex Smith, Khalid Kareem, right? So like all these guys are training for a high level that when I told Devin, I was like, hey, they're not going to let me Olympic weightlift. And I tried to be mopey about it, right? I was like all sad. I was like, what am I going to do now? Devin Allen was the one who was like, dude, you've been running track and field with us, during COVID. Like, why don't you get a blade and just try to run? I was 275 pounds. 12% body fat. There is no way at that time frame I was running 100 meters. Okay. So the first instinct that I told him, I was like, dude, I don't think track and field's going to be for me. I got a blade. Come to find out, I ended up loving it. And it's not track and field that I love. It's the progression, man. It's learning. I finally learned how to get out of the blocks. I finally learned how to truly trust the prosthetic. I finally learned how to so my biggest problem was my arms were swinging opposite of the blade, right? So psychologically, I felt like I was running well and my coach was yelling at me because he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I feel like, because you can't feel or see, right? So that's kind of what deviated into it, man. And then Sonny Webster was the one who told me, he's like, get into CrossFit. And I was like, I don't want to do CrossFit. Like, I used to be the guy who clowned CrossFit, and I got into it. So now 3 years later, like, it's just been, so it's the people that I surrounded myself around that really assisted getting better. And just, so I really haven't had a moment yet to like sit back and be like, wow, I'm an amputee. I don't think it's going to hit me. And I hope when it does, it doesn't drastically punch me in the face. But what you need to understand, man, is like, so at nationals, Matthew Brewer, he's a Paralympic skier. He showed up with one of the prosthetic companies. His wife asked him, she was like, hey, what is the biggest highlight for you so far at nationals? And he was like, watching John Edward Heath teach these younger female amputees how to get out of the blocks was like my biggest highlight, to see someone at a high level take the time to coach individuals. So my career has been coaching, mentoring, changing laws, starting nonprofits, finding out how to find sponsorships for adaptive athletes, finding out how to put us in rooms that the average person is never in. If you look at my social media, I'm always at NFL sidelines. I'm always in dugouts with the Major League Baseball. I'm always doing stuff with hockey. Luckily, all of the resources and stuff I did prior to being an adaptive athlete, I was able to bring over to the adaptive and Paralympic side. So honestly, I don't think I regret the amputation. Are there days like when I have infections and I can't wear a prosthetic that I get super emotional and super pissed? 100%, but I'm human. But everything that I'm doing in this community, I truly believe God put me through it because the community needed a voice like mine.
I like that. The Adaptive Athletics Foundation that you started, you want to share a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so what we do at AAFMD is we are turning gyms adaptive. So when I realized that we're about to have an influx of amputees with new prosthetics, who are going to teach these people how to function with these new prosthetics. If you go to the average CrossFit gym, or even a global gym, or some sort of YMCA, the average coach does not have the knowledge on an adaptive athlete. And again, going back to what I said, it's not that they don't care. Why would you get an adaptive certification if you don't have adaptive athletes? Okay, that's a $1,500 to $2,500 certification. What I'm doing is I'm providing equipped product gear to these gyms, and then I'm certifying coaches in adaptive coaching, right? And what that means is I find different adaptive certifications and whatever fits your niche. If you're at a global gym, I don't really see a certain certification, being part of your curriculum. If you're at a CrossFit gym, then this is the certification I find specifically for you. So there's different entities and different spaces that we are taking the coach and pairing them with a adaptive coaching certification, and we're paying for it. And then the third thing is, what I realize is we don't have an adaptive disabled community in the DMV, and that's what I'm building through this nonprofit.
So some of the funding goes to the specific gyms and not just the athletes that they serve, but to like Correct. A gym owner to get some of that adaptive equipment or to get the necessary
Correct.
training.
Correct.
Is it exclusive to the DMV area, or can people outside of? Yeah.
Outside.
Yeah. So we'll definitely link that in the show notes if anyone's interested in getting support through that. We've had Equip Products on the podcast. They make great stuff. We have a bunch of their gripping aids and mute ropes and various things at our gym here. I think that's like one misconception, is that people think that you have to have all these highly complex pieces of equipment to start supporting people with disabilities in your gym. And ultimately, sometimes it's just like those small changes, whether it's a gripping aid for someone who has a limb difference or a specific jump rope, specialized piece of equipment. It doesn't have to be crank cycles and gait trainers and all these complex things to start supporting people with disabilities.
No, 100%. And that's the thing, is when people think like I'm turning gyms adaptive, they're under the impression that I'm coming in and like gutting their whole gym. That's not it. We can work with what you've got. You just need certain things for somebody who's missing a hand, right? Like, how are they going to use that ski erg or whatever the case may be? So it's just the knowledge, man. It's just really learning how to adapt a workout and regimen and program to somebody with a disability.
Yeah, so I think we kind of already answered the question then, but we ask all the guests what they think needs to be done to make the fitness industry more accessible. Can you kind of maybe like button up a couple pieces of advice?
Yeah, so I think so. I'm going to give you an example. I went to a gym and there was no handicap spot. in their gym. And I was like, hey, just to let you know, like, I work with the Secretary of Disabled Affairs for Maryland. Like, if I were to bring this up, like, you're violating ADA. And they were like, well, we passed our inspection. And I was like, well, your inspector was lazy because it is a requirement for a handicap spot, especially in a facility like this, right? So I think that going just a little extra step to make sure that there are things, how are you going to gravitate the disabled community if you're requiring them to park down the street to come to your gym? So that's number one. Number two, not all your coaches need to be adaptive certified. But when I find gyms that I've spoken to in the Maryland area, like half of the gyms that I'm helping do this with, they've already got an adaptive coaching certification. That means so much to me because it means that you actually want to bring the demographics of the disabled community to your gym. Because the biggest thing that CrossFit does is they sell it as community. I don't think that's true. Why? Because when the elite adaptive athletes go out to compete, all the community disappears and no one's watching or supporting, right? So when you're watching affiliates or gym owners that are taking that extra step to like make sure that there is, I don't know, something minimum as like the base of a ski erg for a wheelchair, that's the start. One coach out of 10 has an adaptive coaching certification. That's a start, right? Versus walking into like a Gold's Gym and then being like, yeah, we don't really know what to do with you. So that would be the first thing. And then the other thing for coaches, get out of your comfort zone, man. Disabled people are not broken people, right? I get it. People look at it and they're like, this is probably a liability, or I don't want to hurt this person. Listen, a little dark humor in the disabled community, you can't break my amputation worse than what it is, right? You're not going to put a seated athlete in another wheelchair. They're already disabled, right? So,
we say disability isn't synonymous with injury, but I think that's like one thing that people think, and that all athletes with disabilities have to go to physical therapy or they should be treated by a physician. And if the only opportunity you have to exercise is a once a week, twice a week PT appointment where they're focusing on a specific impairment and not like global health improvements, then you're not really addressing some of the secondary health conditions that are going to be so prevalent for people with disabilities. 100%. So just like making community-based organizations more inclusive and accessible is something I'm strongly passionate about as well. And like you said, $1,500, $2,500 for a certification when they don't have any adaptive athletes. It's like, but then you also said like you need to showcase to those athletes that you're willing to support them. So you have to be proactive, I guess, in the sense where you might not have any adaptive athletes right now, but you're not going to attract any unless you kind of make that effort to do so. For us, about a quarter of our members have disabilities at my gym. That's obviously a huge revenue generating asset. And I think sometimes people just think inclusion has to be a charitable endeavor, but for us, it's been like a necessary part of our business and a very important one. So,
and that's the thing is like, how many disabled people are like very successful people? Nobody's asking for a free handout.
Yeah.
They're not going to come pay your gym membership for something that doesn't apply to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So finding ways to, I guess, modify both workouts and pieces of equipment to make them accessible, just adhering to ADA standards, being aware of the ADA standards. We cover some of the most basic ones, not to say that they're not all important, but we cover some of the more basic ones in like the course that we teach, just in terms of like parking spaces and door entrances and walkways and how equipment should be structured. I think sometimes it's tough in the global gyms because they try to pack as much equipment as possible into a space, and then that makes it hard to kind of adhere to those physical accessibility guidelines.
Right.
Yeah. So, but CrossFit, open floor space, that's really good for physical accessibility. It's pretty easy to navigate around a CrossFit gym typically. So,
and that's kind of why I picked that, right? I mean, I'm not limited to gyms. I just feel that what CrossFit gyms have kind of already meet the mold, right? So it's not, my nonprofit isn't just looking to turn CrossFit gyms adaptive. It's just right now in the space that we're in, like, do I want somebody with a very severe spinal cord injury trying to find an elevator to go to the third floor for the Lifetime Fitness and then going in there and then there's no equipment? Or do I want them to just go down the street to the local CrossFit gym that has the space and he or she doesn't have to worry about getting in an elevator? They just wheel into the gym, right? So it's those are key factors into like what I'm thinking about. But it's not just gyms, right? Like I'm trying to bring a para program to the University of Maryland, right? The University of Michigan has a phenomenal, right? Alabama, Chicago, like Illinois, all those universities have Division I para track and field programs. We don't have any of that in the East Coast, you know? So it's like, it's not just the gym spaces. I'm also creating like, why don't we have these programs? How many disabled students do we have? How many disabled students want to play some sort of sport or go to a college that has accessibility for them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to talk afterwards, because University of Michigan, University of Arizona were two of the universities that took my course, and they had all the trainers in their health center take the course. And I guess my vision was, let's make the rec centers more accessible so students on campus with disabilities have the same opportunities to train. One of the challenges with that is that there's so much turnover in the campus rec staff, in terms of like students become student trainers, but then they graduate, and then you have to educate the next group, and so on and so forth. But Michigan really seems to be creating the standard, and they're putting great frameworks in place for how other universities can.
I just ran at their first meet at the Miller Open, and listen, they've been trying to hire me as their strength and conditioning coach. Dr. O has been trying to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, did you meet Dr. O and Eric?
I did. And let me tell you, like, if it wasn't in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? Because if I'm gonna live in those conditions, I might as well just go back to Iceland. But it's just the facility, man, and the staff, and they grew from 8 students to 40. Like, that may not be a big number to people, but like, that's a big deal in a Division I program, you know?
Yeah. And I know they're building a framework to make it repeatable across other universities as well. They're not just like settling in with like, how can we make Michigan the best? They're looking at like, how can we make adaptive sports more popular across the country. So shout out Michigan. Another shout out to another.
Another shout out. You get a shout out.
So we'll include it in the show notes as well. But if people want to follow the work that you're doing and your competition coming up, where would you recommend that they find you?
Instagram, anything Carbon Fiber John is my trademark. But honestly, right now I need support, man. At the Adaptive Athletics Foundation of Maryland, we're looking for resources. We're looking for sponsorships. We're looking for disabled people. I think the hardest thing in this space is like, most clinicians cannot give you a list of their disabled people, right? And you're like, but I'm trying to do so good, right? Like, I'm trying to change the world. So honestly, my biggest role, like, that helps me, is social media. So just, you know, we have a Instagram pages. We're working on a Facebook page. The website's being created so far, but I have a very, very good feeling about what we're doing with this nonprofit, and I'm really excited to see what 2025 has to offer for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for everything that you do for people with disabilities, and kind of pushing that expectation. I think that's really important to me, is elevating the expectation that people have for adaptive athletes, like not viewing Paralympics as a lesser service, but looking at it as just a slightly different but highly competitive avenue for athletes. So thank you for kind of being a driving force behind that.
Yeah, and you as well, man. Everything you're doing, I also appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.